Thank you, Mr. Kramer, for finding time in your busy schedule to talk to Tabula. And let's talk about the purpose of your visit. What brings you here this time?
This is a conference with Stanford University and the European Policy Center that looks at the spirit of democracy. And so I was invited to join with some American colleagues, Larry Diamond, Steve Krasner, and it's a great opportunity for me to come back to Georgia. I unfortunately have not been here since 2008, so I was very eager to come back. It's a brief visit, unfortunately, but the weather has been terrific. The people, as usual, have been very welcoming and warm, so I'm very pleased to be back here.
Well, since, the major topic of the conference was the democracy, how would you describe the state of Georgian democracy? You've been following the developments quite closely as the director of the Freedom House, and afterwards, I know your interviews.
Until November of last year, I was the president of Freedom House for 4 years, and we had been concerned about the state of affairs for several years, and Georgia, I think, certainly has been an example when it comes to elections and transfers of power. Georgia has conducted elections that have generally met the test for the OSCE and other monitoring organizations that have good reputations, and we have seen those who have lost those elections agree to the results and transfer power peacefully. But I think we've also seen in Georgia in the past year or so concern about the scope and scale of investigations and arrests and pretrial detentions of people who had been in the government before and now in the opposition. That, I think, has been the main area of concern. There have been also areas of concern about control and influence over the media, and frankly about the role of Mr. Ivanishvili and his role sort of behind the scenes, having stepped down as prime minister.
Actually, there is a consensus among Georgian public that Mr. Ivanishvili is an informal ruler of the country. Well, when the government is asked the same question, they say that, of course, he is the most influential figure, and that's just fine. It's natural.
In many countries, including democracies, there are people who are not elected officials who play influential roles in decision-making and policy formulation. That's relatively normal. That's to be expected. But for one individual to be the most influential, as you described it, is, I think, a cause for concern because he's not elected anymore. He's not accountable through normal political processes. And the president, the prime minister, people in elected positions, including in the parliament, those are the ones who have accountability. Those are the ones that voters can decide they've had enough, they want to make a change at the next election. But if someone is pulling the strings behind the scenes, it's much harder to try to have control over that individual. And that's why I think there is significant concern.
You've just mentioned jailing of opposition figures or prosecution. There were numerous indictments, so on and so forth, as a concern. And actually, you were the one who compared the actions of the current government, vis-a-vis the political opposition, to that of Viktor Yanukovych. Is there anything the West can do to somehow influence the process? Is there any lesson the West can learn from Yanukovych, Ukraine example? Because we all know how tragically it ended.
The politicization of the judicial process, of the legal process, of the prosecutor general's office, of the courts, is a very negative development in any country. It undermines the credibility of what are supposed to be independent processes and institutions. When the prosecutor general's office is used to go after political opponents, you undermine the credibility of the process. It's not to say that people who were in the government and are now in the opposition are immune from prosecution, are completely innocent in all cases. There may be cases where investigations are fully warranted. where a case should be brought to a court of law and a judge or a jury should decide. But again, it's the scope and scale that the new government, the new prosecutor general, pursued these cases that, in my view, and I think in Freedom House's view, lacked real credibility. That it seemed like it was driven more by motivation of revenge rather than genuine pursuit of a legal process and neutral decision making. And it can do terrible damage to a country's reputation in terms of Western influence and ability to try to raise the concerns. There are a number of assistance programs, including from the United States, the Millennium Challenge Corporation program, that do offer some mechanisms by which the United States and other Western countries can try to influence the situation. And in fact, some of these programs are conditioned on making sure that there is good governance and proper rule of law, not rule by law, in countries such as Georgia. So we do need to make sure that we use those effectively. And again, there's a tricky balance between sending the wrong signal, which is if you've served in the government, you're immune from prosecution in the future. You can do whatever you want. But then that balance is offset by the need to make sure that if a new team comes into power through an election, that team then doesn't abuse power by punishing the previous team, because then you reduce the incentive for transfers of power. When someone comes to power, if he or she thinks that they'll be subject to a politically motivated prosecution after losing, then they'll never want to lose. They'll make sure they always win elections or eliminate elections and stay in power as long as possible to avoid politically motivated prosecutions.
Do you see any correlation between the level of democracy and the security of the nation?
Yes, is the short answer. And let's, I mean, certainly we could talk about Georgia. Let me take Ukraine more specifically.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I'm moving to.
That's, I think, the more pressing case right now. It is incredibly difficult for a new government that frankly didn't expect to be in power at this point, or even as of last spring, to try to deal with corruption, economic reform, to stabilize the financial situation, deal with a declining hryvnia, and at the same time worry on a daily basis that Russian forces are going to move further into Ukrainian territory and take over the country. It's almost impossible. It's not to say that as long as you have an invading force, you can ignore the necessary economic reforms. You have to do both, but it's incredibly difficult. And this is where I would argue the West needs to do a better job of supporting Ukraine. Ukrainian officials should be focused on dealing with the economy, dealing with corruption, doing a better job. The firing or dismissal of Mr. Kolomoisky is going to be an interesting development to see how that plays out. The arrests of two officials during a cabinet meeting, televised, will send a signal, I think. I hope that there is a new determination to deal with corruption in Ukraine. But at the same time, you have Russian forces threatening Mariupol, the possibility of a move against Kharkiv, and it's terribly destabilizing to Ukraine to have that as a major concern every single day.
You just said that the West needs to do the better job in supporting Ukraine. What exactly do you mean? What West should do and is not doing?
The West has done a decent job when it comes to sanctions. I think the Europeans and the Americans, Canadians, Australians, Japanese even, have done a good job of imposing sanctions on Russia, better than Putin thought they would. Still, I would argue the sanctions have been too slow, too reactive. We have let Putin set the agenda, and then once he has taken action, the West then responds. Still, you compare where we are in terms of Western sanctions policy to where things were before February of last year, it's a total sea change. Where I find the area for biggest fault, the biggest mistake, and I blame my president, President Obama, personally for this, is the refusal to provide military assistance to Ukraine so that it can defend itself against further Russian aggression. Ukrainians have asked for this for months, going back to last year. President Poroshenko visited Washington September 17th, gave a speech before a joint session of Congress in the morning, Then in the afternoon, he met with the president in the Oval Office, and the president delivered a lecture to him instead and said, I'm not going to give you what you've asked for. And the Ukrainians went home empty-handed and worried about the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine. The U.S. Congress, huge support.
Yeah.
Democrats and
More
Republicans.
than 300 votes, yeah.
348 to 48 in a House resolution just the other day. Unanimous passage of the Ukrainian Freedom Support Act in December. Republicans, Democrats, this is not a partisan issue, have been calling for the U.S. to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. It is the President of the United States who has refused to do so. The Secretary of State has supported this. The Secretary of Defense has supported this. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of National Intelligence, the Supreme Allied Commander in NATO, everyone has except the President of the United States. In our system, I think for all of its flaws, is still the best system, endows the President of the United States with the final authority on foreign policy issues. So the Congress can pass resolutions, it can pass legislation, but the President at the end of the day makes the foreign policy decisions. I think his decision on this particular case has been a terribly wrong decision, however.
Yeah, well, there are many who claim that America is in decline, is a declining power, and there are some who say that the decline is a choice of the U.S. leadership.
President Obama was elected and came into office on two campaigns, really. One was nation building at home, with an emphasis on health insurance for all who were uninsured, and then ending two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. And he has passed healthcare legislation. He has withdrawn troops from Iraq, although there are now some going back. And there is a withdrawal set for Afghanistan, although the timing of that has slowed down as well, particularly after President Ghani's visit to Washington in this past week. The president announced several years ago a pivot to Asia, which then became known as a rebalance. If you pivot from one area to another, you're not only pivoting to somewhere, you're pivoting from somewhere. And so the president pivoted away from Europe. And so I think there is a clear sense in Europe, Georgia, Ukraine, you name it, that the United States is disengaged, that it is not as active as it had been in the past. I agree with that assessment. I think the United States has not been as active in Europe. I think the president felt that our business in Europe was finished, was done. He, of course, wants to do a big trade deal with Europe, but that is quite far down the road. There's one with the Pacific nations that is further along. I think the whole notion of the pivot sent the wrong signal to Europe, including to Moscow, because I think Putin inferred from that the United States was not paying as much attention to Europe as we had in the past. And to be fair to the president, he came in inheriting a very difficult economic situation, and he came in with a country that was growing increasingly weary of the war in Iraq in particular, but also Afghanistan. And so he wanted to bring about change from that, and felt that the Bush administration, and I served all 8 years in the Bush administration, had done things that were harmful and counterproductive to the country and to the world. I do think the president has a general view that the United States often does more harm than good. And I think he's wrong. But this whole notion of leading from behind that came up with the intervention on Libya, where France and the UK were the leading powers on that. Leading from behind does seem to sum up the president's approach to foreign policy.
They were fighting with the United States arms, and the planes, and it was the United States.
The United States was there.
Yeah.
But it was more behind the scenes, although the United States certainly did a lot in preventing a massacre in Benghazi. And then, of course, the mistake we made in Libya. We did the right thing intervening in Libya. I think there's no question about it. That was the right thing to do. But then the huge mistake we made in Libya, one of the reasons it's an absolute mess these days, after we intervened dealing with Benghazi and Gaddafi was removed from power, we then washed our hands of Libya. We acted as if Libya on its own, despite 4+ decades of the madman Gaddafi, would be able to set up democracy on its own without outside help. There was a view in the US Congress that Libya didn't need financial assistance from the United States because it was exporting oil and it had its own money. Libya needed all the help it could get. It had no clue how to transition from Gaddafi's rule to any semblance of democracy. I think the United States had been too hands-off in the Arab world. And I think another area where the president made a huge mistake was Syria. The president thinks through President Obama thinks through too much the consequences of action and doesn't think through the consequences of inaction. And in the case of Syria, he drew a red line saying if Assad uses chemical weapons, he was going to take military action. Assad used chemical weapons. The president, after hemming and hawing, debating, going to Congress, seeing Cameron lose a parliamentary resolution in the UK, decided, I'm not going to do it. So what does Putin do? He steps in and helps Obama. And so the United States comes across appearing weak, appearing indecisive, appearing irresolute, and I think we have a whole series of problems as a result of that. And so it's the serious situation, it's the failure to provide military assistance in Ukraine, and one other problem I would argue with the president's foreign policy is, the Washington Post coined this phrase, gratuitous clarity. The president goes out of his way to telegraph to everyone, including our enemies, what we won't do. We have said we will not send troops to Syria. We have said we will not provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. And so what Assad learns from that is there are limits to what the U.S. will do. What Putin learns is I can keep pushing my military as far as I want because the United States is not going to intervene. In this case, it's not just Obama. It's Chancellor Merkel and others who keep saying there's no military solution. Well, Putin thinks otherwise. And unless we're prepared to push back, providing the military support to the Ukrainians that they want, Putin's going to think that there is a military solution.
Well, you just mentioned President Ghani. While President Ghani, President of Afghanistan, was in the United States, NATO Secretary General was in Washington as well. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time in the history of NATO, like when the President of the United States refused to meet with the Secretary General of NATO, and this seemed kind of disturbing, to many. How do you see the future of the transatlantic cooperation? You just mentioned the disengagement of the United States from the European affairs. But there is this NATO, and it's the biggest treaty obligation for the United States to defend its NATO allies. And the European security is in biggest threat since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the end of the Cold War. So where does the transatlantic unity stand at that moment, and how do you see it changing, with the change of the leadership in the White House?
I would actually say on the threat that this is the biggest threat we faced since World War II. Mm-hmm. This is the first forcible annexation of one country's territory by another since World War II. Maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that wasn't necessarily a transatlantic threat. Mm-hmm. So this is a time for U.S. leadership. It's a time for the United States and Europe to work closely together. It is the wrong time for the President of the United States to fail to find the time to meet with the Secretary General of NATO. I'm at a loss to explain why the President can't fit Mr. Stoltenberg on his schedule. It sends a bad signal. And you have, Stoltenberg's in Washington this week for 3 days. And somehow he can't find a short period of time to meet with the President.
Well, it was not even explained by the White House.
Correct.
And the reasons.
Correct. There haven't even been reasons given other than indications that it was a matter of scheduling, which I don't believe.
The rise of populist, extremist, pro-Russian parties in Europe, we see the worrying developments in Europe, Marine Le Pen is running the second after UMP in France. The elections were just over. We see what is happening in Spain, in Germany, so on. So do you see any connection between the success of the pro-Russian populist extremist forces in Europe and the US foreign policy? Do you see any correlation?
There is, and having traveled in Europe a fair bit over the past few months, there is an underlying anti-Americanism that I think is there, that we sometimes don't appreciate in the United States. This sense that the United States throws its weight around too much. There's still, President Bush, as you know, was not a popular leader in most of Europe. Georgia was an exception, I would say. But in many parts, many countries in Europe, President Bush was not popular. There was a lot of hope that came with Obama, that Obama would be the anti-Bush. Obama wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, in large part because he wasn't George Bush. But then I think there is this lingering anti-Americanism. In Germany, it was the NSA issue released because of the material from Edward Snowden. And so there are a number of reasons why there continues to be anti-Americanism lingering throughout Europe. But I think that there is a crucial need for the United States and Europe to patch things up, to get back together. I don't think it's going to happen in the remainder of President Obama's term. I think this is going to have to happen with the next American president, and that person won't be in, whether it's Democrat or Republican, until January 2017. A lot can happen between now and then. Just think back a little over a year ago to Russia-Ukraine, where many people were not anticipating that Russia would be invading Ukraine. So I'm not optimistic that we will see significantly improved relations between the United States and Europe in the remaining part of President Obama's term, and I think that's terribly unfortunate.
Well, and my last question about NATO enlargement, like yesterday at the conference, like your colleagues have expressed like skepticism about about NATO enlargement for the next like many years. Like, what is your take on that? Like, what would be the realistic approach? And if, given the NATO refuses to enlarge, what should the little states like Georgia do to make sure like that they're secure?
Well,
what are the options?
I don't think NATO is not going to refuse to enlarge. It may decide next year not to enlarge at the summit in Warsaw, but NATO is not going to close the door. At the Brussels forum that the German Marshall Fund sponsored last weekend, I had an opportunity in front of the whole group to ask Secretary General Stoltenberg about keeping the door open for Ukraine. I asked EU High Representative Mogherini the same question, and both said the doors remain open. That is decades-old NATO policy, to keep the doors open to aspiring nations.
Where is that door?
Yes, and it should be the case that countries that want to join, as long as they meet the conditions and then are accepted by the member states of these organizations, they should be able to join. Keeping the door open, in my view, is an incredibly important incentive for countries to undergo difficult reform. If they see at the end of the reform, not that there's ever an end to the reform process, but at a certain point in a reform process, that they can then join institutions that help identify them and root them in Euro-Atlantic institutions, then that is a very positive thing. I think if you look at the Baltic states, if you look at Poland, still Czech Republic, Hungary, the prospect of membership in NATO and the EU was an extremely important incentive for them to undergo difficult reform. I think the same should be held out for Georgia. I think the same should be held out for Ukraine. I think the same should be held out for Montenegro. It doesn't mean that Georgia and Ukraine are going to join NATO next year. In Ukraine right now, they're too busy with other things. But I think the notion of Finlandization, as Dr. Brzezinski has been talking about, including at the Brussels forum last week, is a terrible idea. And I don't frankly understand why Dr. Brzezinski is promoting it, given his past views. To me, the best way is to let Ukrainians decide, let Georgians decide, and there's wide support, I believe, still here in Georgia, whether they want to join NATO, whether they want to join the European Union. And if they meet the conditions, then the next step is for the member states of those organizations to vote on accepting these countries. Doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but we shouldn't take it off the table, because otherwise the United States and Russia are effectively giving Russia a veto over countries joining or not joining, and making decisions over the heads of Georgians and Ukrainians, and I would hope that those days are long in the past.
Well, thank you very much again, like for finding time in your busy schedule and for like extremely interesting conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Pleasure.